50%. That single number detonated the North American aluminum industry. In June 2025, the United States slapped a 50% tariff on Canadian aluminum, and in doing so, triggered what may become the most catastrophic miscalculation of Trump's entire trade war. Within months, American Midwest aluminum premiums exploded by 139%, 6 U.S. smelters limped along at barely half capacity, and industries from autos to construction began scrambling for supply that simply does not exist domestically. Here's the brutal reality Washington refused to confront: America cannot make aluminum without Canada. The United States now produces just 1.2% of global aluminum, while a single Canadian smelter in Quebec nearly matches total U.S. output. And when Trump believed tariffs would force submission, Canada did something far more dangerous: it walked away. 2.7 million tons of aluminum were quietly redirected to Europe and Asia. Quebec smelters that once sent 95% south now send only 78%. The leverage shifted overnight. So the question isn't whether Trump's aluminum tariffs backfired. The real question is this: why did Washington choose an economic war it was structurally guaranteed to lose, and how did it turn American strength into irreversible dependency? To understand why this crisis matters, you have to understand what aluminum actually is in economic terms. Aluminum is not just a metal, it is embedded energy, logistics discipline, and supply chain predictability. And the United States has lost control over all three. Modern manufacturing runs on just-in-time supply chains. Automakers, aerospace firms, appliance manufacturers, and construction suppliers do not stockpile aluminum for years. They rely on predictable, frequent deliveries at stable premiums. When that system breaks, factories do not slowly adapt, they stall, reprice, or shut down. The United States once dominated primary aluminum production. Today, it operates 6 smelters, 4 of them partially or fully curtailed, running at roughly 53% capacity. Total output? About 1.2% of global supply. That is not resilience. That is fragility disguised as sovereignty. Contrast that with Canada. Quebec alone produces aluminum at scale, powered by hydroelectric energy priced between $40 and $54 per megawatt hour. In the United States, comparable industrial power costs are 2 to 3 times higher, and rising. Data centers, EV charging infrastructure, and residential demand are pushing U.S. electricity consumption up 1.7% annually through 2026, after nearly 15 years of flat growth. Aluminum smelters cannot compete in that environment. This is why rebuilding U.S. capacity is not a policy choice, it is a physical impossibility under current conditions. Restarting or building a smelter requires 20 years of guaranteed low-cost power, capital investments of $4,500 to $5,000 per metric ton, and long-term price stability. None of those inputs exist. Not today. Not next year. Not under any plausible tariff regime. That is the economic trap Trump created. Tariffs raise input costs for American manufacturers without creating domestic alternatives. The duty is paid not by Canada, but by U.S. importers, absorbing costs they cannot fully pass on to consumers. And here is the most overlooked statistic of all: every Canadian primary aluminum job supports 13 American jobs downstream. When Canadian supply tightens, American workers pay first. This was never a trade dispute. It was an assault on the economic physics of the aluminum industry, and physics does not negotiate. This is where Trump's aluminum war turns from reckless theory into lived economic damage, where the numbers stop being abstract and start showing up on factory balance sheets, payroll decisions, and consumer prices across the United States. Start with the American Midwest, the heart of downstream manufacturing. As Canadian aluminum flows tightened, Midwest premiums surged 139% between February and May 2025, blowing past European benchmarks. This wasn't speculation. It was physical scarcity. Buyers weren't bidding against traders, they were bidding against shutdowns. Automakers felt it first. Ford publicly acknowledged paying hundreds of millions of dollars in aluminum tariffs, costs absorbed internally because passing them on would destroy vehicle competitiveness. Alcoa, importing its own Canadian-produced aluminum into the U.S., reported $115 million in tariff costs alone. This is the surreal outcome of Trump's policy, American companies paying tariffs on material produced by their own subsidiaries because there is no domestic substitute. Then came the regional fallout. In Kentucky, Century Aluminum shuttered the Hallsville smelter in 2024, 600 jobs gone, not because of foreign competition, but because U.S. power prices made continued operation irrational. In Missouri, the New Madrid smelter closed. Nearly 30% of U.S. capacity has vanished in recent years, and what remains operates intermittently, restarting only when prices spike enough to briefly justify electricity costs. Downstream industries began improvising. Construction firms delayed projects. Appliance manufacturers redesigned products to use less aluminum or lower-grade substitutes. Aerospace suppliers faced delivery delays they could not explain to defense contractors. The Aluminum Association warned in mid-2025 that supply disruptions, not demand weakness, were driving a 4% to 4.4% decline in North American aluminum consumption. Demand didn't disappear. Supply did. Trade associations quietly sounded the alarm. One automotive supplier group warned that tariffs intended to secure domestic supply have instead exposed the absence of it. Another industry memo described the policy as a tax on American manufacturing with no industrial upside. This is the ultimate betrayal. Tariffs were sold as protection for U.S. workers. Instead, they punished American importers, American manufacturers, and American consumers, while Canadian producers maintained margins by selling to Europe and Asia at premium prices. Trump expected Canada to crack. What cracked instead was the illusion that the United States still controls the aluminum value chain. Once supply chains reroute, they do not politely return. And as U.S. companies scramble to survive quarter by quarter, Canada is locking in customers that Washington just handed away. While Washington was escalating tariffs, Canada was executing something far more dangerous, a quiet, irreversible pivot. No speeches. No retaliation headlines. Just infrastructure, contracts, and patience. Canadian aluminum producers understood the signal immediately. A customer willing to impose 50% tariffs overnight is not a partner, it is a volatility risk. So Canada did what rational suppliers do, it diversified. By mid-2025, shipments that once flowed almost exclusively into the United States were being rerouted to Europe and Asia. Spain, Germany, France, Italy, countries scrambling for clean, non-Russian, non-Chinese aluminum amid sanctions and net-zero mandates, became eager buyers. Asian manufacturers, seeking geopolitical redundancy away from China's dominance, paid premiums for stable North American supply produced with hydroelectric power. This was not opportunistic arbitrage. It was structural realignment. Canadian producers chartered vessels, leased European warehouses, invested in port logistics, secured sustainability certifications, and negotiated multi-year contracts. These are not temporary moves. They are capital-intensive commitments designed to outlast any single U.S. administration. Every new European buyer reduced dependence on the U.S. market and reduced Washington's leverage permanently. At the state level, Ottawa reinforced the shift. Freight discounts prioritized interprovincial shipments. Federal procurement policies favored Canadian materials. Counter-tariff remission programs were designed with expiration dates that aligned strategically with 2026 trade negotiations, signaling leverage without overt confrontation. Meanwhile, Canada coordinated quietly with allies. Mexico deepened manufacturing integration. The EU welcomed Canadian aluminum as a politically safe input. Even sustainability frameworks became leverage. Canadian aluminum's dramatically lower carbon footprint positioned it as a premium product, not a commodity. And here is the critical asymmetry Trump failed to understand. Canada does not need the United States to buy aluminum, but the United States needs Canada to make things with it. As these new trade lanes solidified, something else happened. Canadian executives stopped viewing the U.S. as their primary customer at all. It became just one market among many, and increasingly, the least predictable. This is what strategic power looks like in modern geopolitics. Not retaliation. Redundancy. Not confrontation. Optionality. By trying to coerce Canada, Washington taught it the most valuable lesson in global trade: never depend on a customer willing to weaponize access. And once that lesson is learned, it is never unlearned. The most dangerous consequence of Trump's aluminum war is not higher prices or lost contracts. It is the collapse of trust, and in geopolitics, trust once broken is almost never restored. For more than a century, North American aluminum functioned as an integrated system. Energy flowed north to south in the form of refined metal. Canada supplied stability. The United States supplied scale and transformation. That system worked because it was predictable. Trump shattered that predictability and replaced it with policy volatility. Even if tariffs were removed tomorrow, the damage would remain. European and Asian buyers who spent 2025 onboarding Canadian supply will not walk away simply because Washington changed its mind. Multi-year contracts, logistics infrastructure, and regulatory alignment have already been built. Supply chains, once diversified, do not reconcentrate. This is where the long game becomes visible. Canada learned that access to the U.S. market can be revoked without warning. That lesson will shape every future trade decision. And allies are watching closely. If Washington is willing to weaponize aluminum against its closest partner, what restraint remains elsewhere? The geopolitical beneficiaries are obvious. China gains leverage as global supply chains fragment and Western coordination weakens. Russia, constrained by sanctions, benefits indirectly when Western markets are forced into inefficient sourcing and higher prices. The West's self-inflicted friction becomes strategic breathing room for its rivals. More importantly, the United States has weakened its own negotiating position permanently. Entering future trade talks, Washington now carries a credibility deficit. Threats of tariffs are no longer persuasive, they are expected. And expectations change behavior. For Canada, the shift is profound. It now understands that aluminum is not just an export, it is strategic leverage. As 2026 negotiations approach, Canada holds options: export prioritization, delivery schedules, remission extensions, allocation frameworks. None require retaliation. All exert pressure. Trump believed aggression would force compliance. Instead, it accelerated decoupling, not from China, but from Canada. That is the irony. In trying to reassert American dominance, Washington made itself less central, less reliable, and ultimately less relevant in a supply chain it once anchored. And geopolitical relevance, once lost, is far harder to rebuild than any smelter. Power in the modern world is no longer about who shouts the loudest or imposes the biggest tariff. It is about who can walk away, and who cannot. Trump believed aluminum tariffs would demonstrate American strength. What they actually exposed was American dependence. The United States cannot replace Canadian supply, cannot rebuild capacity within a generation, and cannot lower energy costs without structural reform. Canada, meanwhile, discovered it holds leverage it never fully exercised before, and now has every incentive to use it. This is the quiet collapse beneath the noise. No dramatic embargo. No headline-grabbing retaliation. Just contracts signed elsewhere, infrastructure built elsewhere, and trust permanently redirected elsewhere. As 2026 approaches, Canada enters negotiations with options. Washington enters with constraints. And every month this policy remains in place deepens the imbalance Trump created. So here is the question that should dominate the comment section. If economic power now belongs to the country that controls energy, stability, and patience, has America already lost the aluminum war it started? The answer may define not just this trade dispute, but the future of North American industrial leadership itself.